Hello, and welcome back to this second episode of my little podcast on starting new congregations, perspectives from history. I'm Arthur Collins, retired United Methodist elder. We're going to go to the first century for our first stop in this tour through history, to the New Testament church. And there's a danger when we do that. Every age of the church has looked to the New Testament and seen themselves in it. And whatever we were doing, we say, see, they're doing that too. And we use the New Testament witness as an endorsement of whatever our current organization and methodology might be for evangelism, for missions, for church planting, for forms of church government, for everything. And yet, as has been said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. There were different challenges and different opportunities, and the first century is not the 21st century. So we need to make an effort to put ourselves back into that time and see it not merely as ourselves, but as perhaps more closely it was. On the day of Pentecost, Jerusalem was filled with thousands upon thousands of Jews from all over the known world, speaking all kinds of languages and wearing all kinds of dress. And of course, the Holy Spirit descended in a mighty rush of wind and tongues of flame upon the apostles, who were hurled out into the street to proclaim the vision of Jesus crucified, risen, and returning, the Messiah. And of all those who heard Peter that day in his sermon, 3,000 believed and were baptized, and then went home. There was no effort to gather them up and make them into anything. They went home to witness to what they had come to believe from what they had seen and heard. And in their home synagogues, they told people about Jesus as much as they knew. And they waited for him to come back because that was supposed to happen. So for a while, the only functional local congregation, as we would understand that term, in all the world was the church in Jerusalem. Everywhere else, people continue simply to attend the synagogue and temple the way they always did, although they witnessed to a new hope there, and they met together in various ways, I'm sure. But the Jerusalem congregation was its own thing, and it was headed by the apostles and the women, the Marys and others who had been so instrumental in offering Jesus hospitality and in witnessing to him. And the apostles approached their role as kind of a board of directors. They thought they'd been put in place to manage this enterprise. The first thing we see them do is electing a replacement for Judas, filling a seat on the board, so to speak. But every time they tried to get organized, something would happen. God would do something else. God would hurl them over here, and God would bring this person in and then present them with this challenge and whoosh them up and drop them somewhere else. And then there came persecution that scattered them and so forth. And they were constantly playing catch up. They could never get organized. They were always following the leading of God and just trying to maintain themselves in their belief and practice. Eventually, things calmed down a little bit and things settled down there. And about the same time, a second local congregation that we know about arose in Antioch, capital of the big province. And in Antioch, they didn't have any apostles, and they didn't have the women. I mean, they had women, but they didn't have the women. And so that church was headed by prophets and teachers. And Barnabas went up there and got a good look at it and stayed to help guide this powerful new expression of discipleship, this outpouring of strength and power from God. And he looked at this and thought to himself, this needs a really first-rate mind so that we don't just have the big experience, but that we conserve this harvest and we harness all this power to drive something. And he went to Tarsus to get Saul, whom we know better as the Apostle Paul. Saul had been pretty much in retirement in his hometown since his radical conversion to belief in Jesus on the way to Damascus. The Christian church had accepted him, but not really trusted him. And so he went home and he spent the next several years kind of just getting his head together and reorganizing his soul around his allegiance to Christ. And so when Barnabas came over to get him, he said, yeah, I'll come. And so the two of them were very prominent among the leaders of the Antiochene congregation, which is where the believers were first called Christians. Well, and it was from the Antioch church that the Holy Spirit spoke to the prophets and teachers there, saying, set apart Saul and Barnabas for the work I have for them. And they were sent off on what is called Paul's first missionary journey. And we hear missionary journey and we immediately think of missions the way we do missions. And it wasn't quite like that. They were being sent to the boondocks, particularly up to Galatia, which was the backwater of the Roman Empire. I mean, no major trade routes went through there. It was a hard slog to get anywhere. But Saul and Barnabas went to find those synagogues that were in such out-of-the-way places that you would assume they didn't have anyone present in Pentecost or might not otherwise have heard of the coming of Jesus and his crucifixion and resurrection and the outpouring of Holy Spirit. And so Paul and Barnabas go first to Cyprus and then up through Pisidia, and they wind up finally going over the mountains into central Anatolia, where the Galatians lived, visiting synagogues. And although they kept tripping over Gentiles and half Gentiles and had to figure out what to do with them, they always went to the local synagogue first. Even after hashing out the place of Gentiles in the new movement with the church in Jerusalem, the Council of Jerusalem that we read about, on subsequent journeys, Paul always went to the synagogue first because it was a Jewish gospel sent to the Jews about a Jewish Messiah. And Gentiles were welcome, but they were not usually thought to be much interested unless they showed their own initiative to do so. And sometimes, in some places, I'm sure whole synagogues would believe, and you would kind of leave behind a believing synagogue, which is in effect a Christian church now. But in most other times, there would be disagreement. Not everyone would believe. And so the question comes down to, how are we going to behave ourselves in a synagogue where some believe that Jesus changes everything and some believe that Jesus changes nothing or is even a fraud. And the best example I know of was in Corinth. When Paul came there, he went to the synagogue, he preached Jesus and the resurrection. A fair number of the Jewish believers there accepted that message. A fair number didn't. Among those who did accept that message and believed was Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. But he couldn't bring the whole synagogue along with him, however respected he might be. And Paul, not willing to be a source of ongoing irritation, took those believers and went next door to the house of Titius Justus to preach and teach. Titius Justus, that's a Roman name. He was probably a Gentile God-fearer. How far he'd gone on the path of becoming a Jew is open to question. God-fearer maybe, proselyte maybe a convert. But in any case, he welcomed Paul and the other believers. And so now next door to the Jewish synagogue, there is a Christian church operating as a church. And of course, the synagogue meets on Saturday and the church begins to meet on Sunday, because that's the day of the Lord. Even in those towns where Christians are still going to synagogues, there's an extra gathering of Christians on Sunday because that's their day. And the same pattern is seen all over the diaspora. In place after place, some believe, some don't. And Christianity and Judaism began to become aware of each other as not merely different options within the variety of Second Temple Judaism, but as different movements. And as they articulate their positions, it comes down to a kind of a binary choice. If you believe Jesus is the Messiah, that places some obligations on you. If you believe that Jesus is not the Messiah, can you let these Jesus people continue to be in leadership of the traditional Judaism? And so you begin to see separation everywhere. Back in Jerusalem, when Paul finally returns after years abroad, he shaves his hair and beard in fulfillment of a vow, and he goes to pay off his vows in the temple, as he would always do. And there he is set upon by a Jewish mob who are giving him the message that no matter how much you may think you're still a Jew, we don't think you're not much of one any longer. And it's getting to the point where Jews and Christians are moving beyond merely scholarly debate and religious dogmatics. It's now getting personal and it's getting organizational. Nevertheless, those early Christian churches were basically Christian synagogues. Our liturgy, our calendar, our scriptures, our sacraments all have Jewish roots. I was explaining this one time to a confirmation class, and a young girl said, "You mean we're all Jewish wannabes?" And I said, well, maybe a better way to look at that is to say that Christianity is a Jewish religion practiced these days mainly by Gentiles. But you know, all movements experience this if they go on long enough, not just religious movements, but political movements and aesthetic movements and educational institutions and so forth. New teachings arise and have to be balanced against old teachings, and sometimes they're adopted as in harmony with that. But sometimes those new things are not seen as in harmony with who we've always been and what we've always done, and you have conflict. And sometimes the new takes over the old and edits the past to show that they were always right. But an awful lot of the time, there comes a separation. And sometimes those who are leaving leave voluntarily and call themselves reformers. And sometimes those who leave involuntarily because they're called heretics. But however that works out, the two groups then not only organize themselves along similar lines, but they have to define themselves as over against each other. And not only do they have to figure out how to claim the same turf they've always occupied, but they have to divide up certain other things and say, well, we're this, we're not like those people because they're like that, and so forth. You see this with the first renewal movement in the Christian church, Montanism. There were people who believed that the great Holy Spirit days were being forgotten and they wanted to get them back, and they couldn't get the church at large to be quite that doggone all about it. And so they separated and they became a different kind of renewal movement. You see it in the Franciscans in the Middle Ages at a time of great corruption in the church. They didn't leave the church, but they found a new way to do church, which was very attractive. You see it in the Reformation. The Reformation is not a separation movement, certainly not in the beginning. The Reformation was only the latest chapter in a 2 centuries argument about how to reform the church. And for a long time, even after the separation of into what we now call denominations, for a long time, there were Protestants who thought, you know, we could still find a resolution with the Catholics. And there were still Catholic bishops who thought, you know, the Protestants have a lot of good ideas. And it took a while before the two groups defined themselves over against each other as we're not those kind of people. And we're the true believers, and those people have been wrong all the time, and they're still wrong, and so forth. And it's taken 500 years for Protestants and Catholics, by and large, to look at each other and say, you know, we should have found a way to fix that. You have the same thing in colonial America in the Congregational Church, which was taken over by Unitarian teaching. For a long time, all the prominent pulpits in New England Congregationalism were occupied by Unitarians trained at Harvard University, which had been taken over by Unitarians. And eventually that phase passed, and the Unitarians, for some reason, left. They didn't take over Congregationalism. explicitly. They left to form a new Unitarian organization, which is still in existence. And of course, for us, the prime example of this incubation of one movement inside another movement is the Wesleyan revival and the rise of the Methodists, who were, according to John Wesley, supposed to be a lay renewal movement within the Anglican Church. Wesley didn't want the Methodists to be separate from the Anglican Church. He wanted his Methodists to go to the local parish church for baptism and for communion and so forth. He wanted them to respect bishops, even if the bishops didn't respect them. But his followers kept saying, you know, we have our own chapels, we have our own preachers, we want our own sacraments, and we don't want to have to depend on the people who despise us. We want to be a church. Well, Wesley had to let the North American Methodists go in his lifetime to form the Methodist Episcopal Church of North America, 1784. He kept the Methodists in England in the fold until after his death, and then many of them left to form the Methodist Connection in Great Britain. Many stayed in Anglicanism. But we became what we are as Anglicans, and we've kept Anglican theology as our baseline dogma. We've kept an Anglican view of the sacraments and of ordination. We have kept various other things that we get from the Church of England, even though we have been independent now for well over 200 years. So sometimes when the time comes to separate, you take with you what you can and you organize over here somewhere, and you become a new thing, because you can no longer stand the conflict with the people in the old shell who had different priorities. There arose within Methodism a new set of teachings. We used to call it liberalism, and now we call it progressivism, which has taken over the United Methodist Church, at least its hierarchy in much of the American church and the Western European church. And the traditionalists, evangelicals, and other Orthodox folk have fought against this for a long time, trying to call us back to the principles and doctrines and practices upon which we were founded. And for a while, we thought we were going to make it. At the special called General Conference in 2019, lo and behold, the global church spoke and the traditionalists won hands down. And for a while, it looked like the traditionalists were going to inherit the United Methodist Church and the progressives would go somewhere else. And then the progressive leadership said, no, we're going to stay and we're just going to act as if we'd won. And so the church became ungovernable. And rather than tear it apart, contesting for control of it, many of the traditionalists said, okay, if that's the way it's going to be, then we'll have to leave. And that's the source of the preparations that have been going on to launch the Global Methodist Church ever since. And what's going to happen if and when the protocol you may have heard about passes General Conference, when we finally have a General Conference, is there'll be a mechanism for congregations and clergy to exit the United Methodist Church, which will become the post-separation United Methodist Church, and transfer themselves bag and baggage over to the Global Methodist Church. And there will be many congregations and some whole conferences that will choose to do that. And they will simply transfer over and pick up where they left off, whole congregations with their clergy. And they'll hardly skip a beat except for changing the sign out front. But it's not going to be that easy for an awful lot of people. The movement that has been incubating within United Methodism is not going to exit as whole congregations in every case. There will be congregations, yes, who leave whole, but they won't bring their clergy with them. And there will be clergy who exit who won't bring their congregations with them. One of the first things we'll have to do is concentrate on matching those up so that we don't lose any more impetus than we have to. But also there will be bits and pieces and dribs and drabs of congregations, individuals and small groups and so forth, who would like to find a place for themselves in the new denomination, or if they were involuntarily transferred there with their fellows back in the old denomination. And they will have to be addressed. And so there's going to be a lot of congregations that will have to be formed by gathering up cores of people, enough people in a given place to form the core of a new congregation, and have clergy assigned to them and get them up and functioning and solve their meeting place problem and all the rest of that. Because the alternative is to have a splintering, a ragged separation, where people scatter to all kinds of different denominations instead of something they're used to. They'd go find something new, or where they just quit going anywhere. And we would have a long time gathering up all the people who had been scattered. And so, despite our wanting to launch all kinds of new congregations the way we've been doing it with all the bells and whistles and so forth, I think for the very first few years, maybe the first 3 to 5 years especially, the predominant challenge of the new Global Methodist Church, at least in America, will be gathering up the exiles and forming them into congregations and matching them with clergy and helping them get their feet on the ground. Just like Paul taking people from the synagogue who want to start something new next door and getting them started and finding leadership for them and so forth. And that's going to be a very important moment in launching the new denomination. It won't be a long moment. There will come a time, as there comes a time in all of these things, where just about everybody who has wanted to migrate from one side of the fence to the other will have done so. And those opportunities won't be there anymore to form whole congregations out of people at loose ends who want to belong to something. At the same time, there's a danger with that if we prolong the moment, because remember, movements that separate tend to define themselves over against each other and carry old grudges and polemics forward into their new incarnations. And even after the first few years, when we've gathered up all the scattered people we can and formed them into congregations as best we can, and then we want to get around and talk to the general culture beyond, the whole society, and plant new churches. We want to go out and find people who haven't been part of the church conversation and who particularly have not been part of our fracas. We're going to go find those people who may not even know they need Jesus, but we know they need Jesus, and we're going to gather them up and try to form congregations for them. You know what? They don't care what you're against. They don't care about this old fight. They don't want to join a faction. If you can't show them Jesus whole and beautiful, the way he is and the way you are, they're not going to be interested. And so we're going to have to rapidly address this formation of new congregations out of the exiles, the scatterings of people, the diaspora of traditionalists. But very quickly, we're going to have to move beyond that phase and get on to something else, because that first century moment, if you will, isn't going to last very long. And this is our challenge. Join us next time when we continue on with news from the Roman Empire and the way we start new congregations.